Welcome to CSIS Online. Join us as we bring together top experts and thought leaders to discuss innovative ideas and real-world solutions to global issues, from security and economics to technology and environment. Tune in and be part of the conversation.
If you can't see it, you can't kill it. It's not just the interceptor, but the radars and other means an air defender relies upon to detect an incoming missile, classify it, track it, and develop a fire control solution. And in an environment where missile threats are more complex and defensive sensors are themselves targets, key characteristics of defense design include sensor survivability and capability. I'm Tom Karako, Senior Fellow with the Defense and Security Department and Director of the Missile Defense Project here at CSIS. And over the years, one of our project's signature themes has been our team's research on exactly this topic: how to diversify the sensor architecture and make it more resilient. Now, the policy world is familiar with a lot of discussion in recent years about the need to change our approach to exquisite space sensors, to not rely so much on a handful of big, fat, juicy targets, and instead to embrace proliferation. A similar problem and opportunity applies to other domains as well. And we've seen in recent years exquisite air defense radars destroyed in a number of recent conflicts. In the recent conflict with Iran, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and of course in Ukraine. The need here is a sensor architecture that is less susceptible to suppression. One way of doing that is to bring the principle of proliferation or distribution down from the heavens to the earth. The Missile Defense Project has done many reports on this topic over the years, and we're delighted today to take another bite at this problem. With me is Masao Dahlgren, a fellow with the Missile Defense team, who has been working on one aspect, mesh sensing for air and missile defense, and passive and proliferated surface-based sensors specifically. We'll be taking audience questions, so please submit those on the event webpage, and we'll get them here. So, Masao, the title of the report is Mesh Sensing for Air and Missile Defense, a Vision for Passive and Proliferated Sensor Networks. We're going to talk about all kinds of the aspects of that vision, its potential and its limitations. But why don't you begin with telling us what is the big question, or what are the big questions that this report tries to ask and answer?
You know, Tom, I know we have a bit of a sensor obsession here at the Missile Defense Project. When you stare at this problem for longer and longer and deeper, it seems like it always boils down to sensors, right? You need to extend the battle space by extending how far the sensors can see. That often constrains the range of the interceptors we have now. And so, you know, you look at recent defense programs, and proliferation has really become a watchword here. The CCAs, right, in the Air Force, right? Swarms of drones that will accompany fighter aircraft. You look at PWSA, the Proliferated Warfighter Space Architecture. That's going to be a major component of Golden Dome. It's a proliferated constellation of satellites in space. And so how do we bring that philosophy to Earth? How do we go from single exquisite things to meshes of things? Or how do those things work together? And so that was a major driver, I think, of this report and why we're thinking about it so much.
Yeah, and this is about two distinct characteristics, both passive, which is not emitting energy and therefore more survivable, but also proliferation. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about what are the characteristics that each of those two features get you, and why they make sense to, in the first instance, pair together in a report and to look at it from the surface?
So that's a question, you know, I've been getting a lot. Why focus on these two things, right? Why not just make it about proliferated sensors? Why not just make it about passive sensors? And there's really a nexus between these two characteristics that we've been looking at in future sensor architectures, right? Our current architecture is built around active sensors, radars, systems that emit energy to try and find the target, you know, shining a flashlight into the dark. And we'd like to have night vision goggles, right? We'd like to have a sensor architecture that wouldn't be seen by the adversary, can't be hit, or can be on when the active sensor is off. And let the active sensor only work in certain times of day, only when it really needs to work. And so there's a nexus here, right? Passive sensors consume very low power. Passive radar, EOIR, that's infrared cameras, basically, visual systems for detection. Those things emit very little power for the range that they can potentially have. And so you might be able to have a network of very low footprint, low power consumption sensors that you could proliferate across the battlefield. So we investigate that. And I guess the second thing I'll say is we try to be provocative in this report. We could talk about distributed meshes of radars and active sensors, but we thought it'd be more interesting and draw a sharper contrast with the architecture we have now to look at this case study of what does a passive sensor network, fully passive, look like.
A passive EOIR network is the case study,
right?
Specifically.
Right. They're cameras.
Right here we've got the U.S. Army's ALPS program, and the P in ALPS is of course passive. We've seen a lot of attention in the Ukraine acoustic sensor, Skyfortress, and you want to talk to us what this is right here?
Sure. I think one thing that really prompted this report is that better compute is making mesh sensing possible, especially for systems like these. We're digging up old history here, really. This is a program called ABF. This sensor was tested in Germany back in the 90s. And it's 4 infrared cameras. I think it's 5 infrared cameras that kind of scan the sky. And they use their rudimentary version of machine learning, computer vision to try and pick out targets, And I think the thing had like a range of like 20, 30 kilometers on a good day and something under 10 on a bad day, right? And that's all well and good. But now, you have sensors that are much higher resolution. Now you have supply chains that can build them at much larger scale, much cheaper, much smaller. Now we have AI systems that can make better use of really bad data. And then now, we can use sensor modalities that haven't been contemplated, right? So, you're in Ukraine. They're using meshes of acoustic sensors, right? $400 smartphones that have a microphone in them. You place them all over the place. It's like a shot spotter system for drones. And so you're able to kind of triangulate the sound of a drone coming in and then turn on an active air defense system to point the radar in the right direction or to get defenders out there. We've had acoustic sensing for over 100 years. We've had acoustic sensing
World War II, World War I.
World War I, before we even had radar. And despite that, we were never able to proliferate because back then we did it by hand, right? You had the big ear trumpets, you hold it up to your ear, you listen for the thing coming in, but now you have a $400 smartphone. So that's the change that hasn't been priced in yet that we want to price in this report.
Yeah, and obviously the technology has changed a lot since, World War I and since the 1990s. But I just want to emphasize, what's the problem we're trying to solve here? That in a world, not merely that missiles have become weapons of choice, but also that with the return of history, it is the ubiquitous surveillance and targeting problem that makes our air and missile defense sensors vulnerable. And back in the early 2000s, when the ABM treaty was a recent memory, and everyone was focused on keeping our national missile defense strictly focused on the rogue state ICBM threat. I remember a concern in the U.S. Senate against going this way, lest we go this way and it be seen as able to be dealing with more complex and integrated air and missile attack from the likes of Russia and China. Well, guess what? We're there now. That is exactly the problem statement. And that, I think, is why a multiplicity of different solutions here are bubbling up and getting different reception, whether it be ALPS, whether it be Skyfortress, whether it be kind of the vision that is laid out here. But I think you said something very interesting there, Masao, that it's not about replacing radio frequency. It's not about going back to World War I in lieu of radar. It's about putting those things together. I want you to talk about the CONOPS, the concepts of operation, about how that might pair together to tee this up.
I think they're absolutely force multipliers, right? We want to create dilemmas. And a dilemma, arises when you have to both optimize to make your thing stealthy against radar and stealthy against infrared detection and stealthy against passive, ultra low frequency radar. That becomes a major problem if you're an aircraft designer in China. And so, we've been thinking a lot about these cases. You mentioned like transparency of the battlefield, right? It is easier and easier to find things, including our own radars, including our own missile defense assets. I mean, people online are like looking for, air defense, batteries all the time, right? And so, given this level of transparency, being able to place so many assets, kind of create a shell game, in the modern battlefield, switching on an air defense radar is dangerous, right? You switch it on, you shine a flashlight in the dark, everyone can see you. And so how do we minimize the instances where you have to spend time kind of pointing the flashlight everywhere and searching for a target, right? You could cue a radar with a forward-based infrared sensor and basically get that extended range, get that pinpoint radar focus beam on the target without being seen.
Yeah, I think it's the word queuing that's important here in terms of connecting to the operational concepts that this enables, which is you're not going to be able to get rid of radars. There's just too much utility and too much value, especially for things that are designed to hide, to deposit large amounts of energy onto a non-cooperative aerial or exo target to be able to track it precisely. But I think what the vision here is to recognize that you can't do everything, but that nevertheless queuing, different radar resource management opportunities, lots of interesting things like that folks might not think about in just a sort of a bifurcated active versus passive. You want to dig into that a little bit?
I mean, different things are good at different things, right? And, we've been stuck in this like radar mindset of, well, everything has to be like a radar. You can have very different sensors with very, very different capabilities that all bring a mix of things to the force. So another thing that was one of the reasons why we focused a lot on EO/IR sensors in this report, right? These camera systems and not passive radar or acoustic sensors, is because they're kind of weird, right? EO/IR sensors have really long range when you're looking very high up. And so imagine if you have like a very low cost, really, low footprint, hard to detect capability placed forward that also doubles as a space situational awareness asset. They can also do a little bit of missile defense queuing and also track a satellite, right? That would be a big deal.
Imagine in Ukraine with air defense.
Right, or queue air defense, yeah. Right? And so those are the kinds of things. And of course, because they have different characteristics, they have different weaknesses, different things that really need to be shored up with radar, right? Like sensitivity to weather. You can't see as far with weather, and that's where kind of the all-weather capability of radars, especially in the S-band, really matter.
Right. So you talked about the different technologies. What are some of the other things that have changed, let's just say since the 1990s? The technological changes. How is it that, whether it be focal planes, whether it be compute, what are the technologies that have changed in the past 30-some years so that while there's nothing new under the sun, there's no new ideas under the sun, as it were, that nevertheless make this a bit more viable? Let's start with the technology side.
Bandwidth, right? Bandwidth is everything. If you're going to place 100 sensors down, that means 100 video feeds or 100 streams of time series data. We're just so much better at processing that, right? You have Jetsons on the edge that can take gigabits per second of video, ultra high res video, and turn it into something that can be sent over a cell phone signal, can be sent over a Starlink, right? You have networks that are able to process this information in real time of 100 different sensors and fuse them together and see if there's a target or not, right? I think that's a major difference. In 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that would have been much harder to do. You just wouldn't have the compute or the networking to do that. And so that's why we're thinking about that a lot now.
Yeah. So to investigate this, in this report, you've got, in some ways, it's a case study of EO/IR. It's not just about EO/IR, it's about this vision for passive sensing and the relation between passive and active generally, to be sure. But nevertheless, using EO/IR as a case study. Talk to us about the methodology. Talk to us about how you went about investigating. Again, this isn't just a commercial for passive, it's an investigation for the potential and the challenges and the limitations of this kind of approach. So what was your methodology to build a scenario and model all this stuff? How did you do that?
Well, thank you, Tom, for helping me explore my pain. There were many long nights spent thinking about this. about how we build these kinds of networks, how we think about these sorts of things. I guess we'll bring up an image too. But we had to write a lot of custom code for this, right? One of the big problems that you think about, that you don't really think about in the beginning, is where do you put these things? You know, you go from 1 sensor to 100. How many do you need to cover a given area? And you know, the deeper you look at this, the harder it gets. You know, how many do you need to cover an irregular shape? We picked an example country like Poland, medium-sized country with varied terrain, as an example to kind of walk through this problem. But you know, do you place them in a grid? If you place them in a grid, you're going to have certain terrain that will shade the field of view, right? Prevent the sensor from seeing what it needs to see. And so you have to optimize where to put all these sensors. And like the more you read about it, you realize this is actually an unsolved math problem. It's an NP-hard problem. It's a famous problem called the art gallery problem, where there's actually no easy answer to what is the minimum number of guards you need to guard an art gallery, right? Well, what are the minimum number of sensors you need to guard Poland? It's challenging, right? And so we brute force this with computers. We use methods like genetic optimization, where you basically guess a design, you guess 100 different designs, you pick the ones that do well, they make it to the next generation, the ones that don't, they die off, and the ones in the middle kind of mutate a little bit. And you sort of optimize towards a best design. And so these images you see here are actually the result of, I don't know, 100,000 plus, hundreds of thousands of runs of simulation, right? Where you place designs, you measure how much they see, and then you optimize. You know, on the left, that is just line of sight coverage of one observer against a target at 20,000 meters, right? 20,000 meter altitude. So that could be like hypersonic plus, right? In the middle, that's line of sight coverage of an optimal, like a completely optimized laydown of sensors for a 2,000 meter class threat. So you might think kind of a low flying aircraft, right? Manned aircraft, helicopters. And then on the right there, it gets so much exponentially harder the lower the target flies. That is line of sight coverage, assuming you have line of sight coverage against a 200 meter altitude threat, right? Low flying drones, cruise missiles, really low flying cruise missiles in the final phase of flight, right? It's about 400, roughly 400 sensors for coverage versus, I think it was like 7 and then 1, right? And so that's a pretty dramatic difference based on the altitude. And we just did a lot of kind of computation, a lot of reading documentation, a lot of wrestling with APIs to do that. And I'm also grateful to all of our partners who provide us you know, these simulation tools to help us do this kind of analysis. You know, it's really valuable to use tools like ANSYS SDK or Lockheed SmartSet to do this kind of work.
Yeah. And so obviously you need more sensors for lower flying threats, and then the question becomes not necessarily, even with more limited range, because of the horizon still exists, nevertheless, it gets queuing and things like that. You mentioned bandwidth, but compute is the other side of the coin that goes here. You know, you also mentioned the art gallery problem and the need for guards. I guess what comes to mind is the number of protesters keep throwing paint on, you know, paintings, and the answer is you need more guards. You always need more guards. You always need more sensors, and I think this is one way of getting after this. But another feature that the report talks about is mission planning, and there's a lot of different pieces of this across the whole .mil-PF, the logistics, all this sort of stuff. So talk to us a bit about. Yes, there's the technology that's gotten better and things like that, but what's some of the challenges and the needs on the mission planning side?
And I think this is what gets back to why we did all of this modeling and simulation. You know, when you're planning a Patriot battery site selection, you know, we read the manuals on how this is done. We talk to people who work on this, right? To optimize against, you know, cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, you do modeling. You see where the threat is coming from. You assess the terrain, and basically you end up picking the highest point that's closest to a road, right? You're picking the site for one thing. But can you do that site selection multiplied by 100? Or as you see in the chart, multiplied by 400? That's where it starts to get really, really hard. And so this is where, you know, the reason we do this kind of analysis is to show how difficult this problem can become and how we need to automate planning on site selection for air defense if we're going to get at this problem.
Which also shows that, while it's hard and different, it's nevertheless tractable, perhaps.
It's doable.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have a computer science degree, and you can go deep on this and you can start to understand from first principles, what are challenging things here. I think that, we're not here to do systems engineering. We're not here to do that, but we can at least show that there's an avenue forward. There are things we ought to look at, and that it is a solvable problem, right?
Yeah, and one of the other pieces here is, I think, a different approach to attritability. You mentioned the Ukraine Sky Fortress, that, to slightly generalize here, cell phones with an antenna sticking up on a pole or a telephone pole or something like that. And a lot of those are unattended. And so how do you think differently about, hundreds of sensors that are going to have a very different approach to logistical signature, to force protection, very different approach than a very sensitive Q-53 radar or a very sensitive TPY-2 or whatever the radar is. Talk to us about that.
I think every think tank report is a mixture of having answers and provoking questions, right? We have some answers in terms of how many sensors do you need. We're going to provoke some questions in terms of how do you secure these sensors, right? Because there are challenges, right? Tamper resistance, encryption, right? The NSA requires encryption boxes on certain sensors that you might place forward in the field. How do the standards need to change if you're thinking about something that's eminently disposable, right? Should we be thinking about these sensors more like we're thinking about, landmines, those kinds of systems? And we're going to have to relitigate some of the conversations, that were had with kind of distributed and dispersed sensors that were had even during the Vietnam War, right? When they were airdropping kind of sensors to detect, trucks in the jungle, right? We can actually do that, and we can do that better. We can use AI to make sense of that. Back then it was questionable. Now it really works, and so that's a really good time to kind of think about those site selection, site security, disposability, tamper resistance features that you might deploy.
And the logistical trail is another thing that comes to mind here. When a couple of Patriot battalions went from Japan and South Korea to the Middle East in anticipation of what in fact became a very robust missile attack by Iran on our partners and friends in Israel, it took a while to get the stuff there. It took a lot of planes to get stuff there. And this is, again, we're not going to get away from the radars. We have to have both of those things. But talk to us a little bit about the mobility piece of this, and I think terrain and things like that.
Sure. And the first thing I want to point out is that mobility is not easy, right? I'll bring up this graph here, but the Patriot movement to CENTCOM was over 70 flights. If you actually look at Army documentation, to get a minimum engagement package, so that's like 2 launchers, a radar, the basics you need to set up a Patriot battalion in an area, it's 7 C-17 flights, or it's 5 C-5A flights at minimum to get that all there. So when we're doing this kind of comparative analysis of logistics and mobility, we have to know what we're comparing against, right? This is a standard by which we're comparing against. And so in many respects, we think that if you're recommending to put out 100 sensors in the field, that will be a mobility challenge in some ways, right? You have to get people to get out there, or maybe you airdrop them, or maybe you co-locate them with existing infrastructure like cell infrastructure. And so that tactical mobility challenge is going to get a lot harder when you're thinking about proliferating on the ground, right? But the strategic mobility challenge might get a little bit easier, right? These sensors could be smaller, they could be lower footprint. Even if you need a lot of them, if they're, maybe they fit on a couple pallets. And so maybe they reduce that logistical tail, these generators and this fuel and all of this you need to carry to operate a very sophisticated and capable radar. And so, we actually did some mobility studies, really rudimentary ones of, the case study area of Poland that we're considering, right? Everywhere in green is places where you could plausibly put a sensor. It's roughly within 1 kilometer of a road, right? Everywhere in green is within 1 kilometer of a road in Poland. There's a lot of places you can drive and put sensors down, right? There's a lot of places. And so this is an area we really flag and we're hoping to provoke on moving forward.
You know, I'm thinking here of some of the past reports, like the space sensor report we did a year and a half ago or something like that. And it's not just admiring the possibility, but as you talked about here, it is definitely looking at the challenges and the limitations. So, what are some other limitations? I'm thinking here of what it gets you, but also what are the limits of bandwidth, of comms, all that kind of thing. What else ought we be thinking about of weather?
So one thing we don't talk about a lot in this report, but is going to be imperative, right, is that bandwidth. And I think it's solvable. I think there's a lot of, there's so much more bandwidth on the modern battlefield than before. But you're going to see that there's just going to be a lot more communications that will be occurring in these kinds of systems, right? So in the case study we did, we optimized a laydown of sensors. We then imported that into another tool, placed them down. We actually tested an engagement scenario where we took, a couple ballistic missiles, a couple hypersonic missiles, and we fired them at NATO installations, in Western Poland, in the eastern flank of NATO. And we saw how many you could shoot down, what you could see. And so this graph is actually from that engagement scenario. At the bottom you see the time in seconds and when in this scenario this happened, right? And the blue is showing the amount of data flow that you're getting from a meshed sensor architecture versus one based around basically an Aegis Ashore site and a Patriot battery in the region, right? The red is kind of these fixed unitary sensors, and the blue is that plus the mesh. And what you're seeing, right, is you're just getting so much more messages, so much more data, much earlier in the engagement from so many different sources that again, you're going to have to think really hard about how you fuse that data, how you communicate that, because there's just a lot more coming.
And what I think was most striking about this graph is the fact that the blue cues begin so much sooner, right? Because they're more distributed, that's where you get the cues. And to just be very clear on our space sensor report a couple years ago, it was all about making sure we had fire control quality tracks to be able to do hypersonic defense. But in this case, it's kind of the opposite philosophy, right? Is you don't necessarily need to get the perfect track to be able to cue your radar to say, hey, you might want to focus your radar energy in this spot. We think something's coming over here. This is kind of how the Sky Fortress works is, hey, something's coming from these coordinates. Why don't you slew in this direction and look for something. If you see something, shoot at it. But this is about early warning.
Right.
Air defense early warning. It's about enabling those operational concepts for radars and all that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah, the data quality requirements in some respects will be lower. In other respects, it'll be higher. But it's very similar to our prior report in this one key respect, right? With the proliferated warfighter space architecture, this satellite constellation, the big bottleneck has been the data layer. It's been things like Forge. It's been things like the transport layer. It's been things like processing all of that data on orbit. That was the thing that, like, all the experts we speak to, all the engineers that we speak to worry about most. How do we fuse sensor data from hundreds of satellites? Well, you're going to have the same issue when you're doing it on the ground. The positive side is that in space, you're power constrained, right? In space, you're bandwidth constrained. On the ground, you don't have to worry about payload weight as much, right? You could put things that are cooled with air. So you don't need a complex thermal system, right? And so you can put better computers on the edge. You could have better bandwidth. You could have better data. There's a lot of advantages to being on the ground.
I think those are some very great points about, again, the potential upside of the vision. But I think another a pretty significant potential downside or limitation, at least or maybe especially in terms of the EOIR category of passive sensing, is weather. Right, it's hard to see through clouds and mist or sandstorms or things like that. Talk to us about this and how what the report talks about here.
We wanted to pick, a concept that had that was interesting, that has some major differences from radar, and I think this is one of them. EOIR sensors, right? These infrared cameras that Elon Musk loves to talk about, right? These infrared cameras are great at seeing at very long distances when things are clear, with very little power. But when your elevation is lower, when you're looking at things more horizontally, so things like drones. When things are cloudy, that detection range can drop significantly by several orders of magnitude, right? And so it is not a replacement for radar. It cannot be for that reason. But it is a forcing function because a lot of future weapons are going to have these same limitations. We talk about directed energy, right? High energy lasers as something to shoot down drones, shoot down cruise missiles. High energy lasers are going to be subject to the same atmospheric extinction and diffraction and diffusion that you're going to see with kind of long range EOIR sensors. And so to get at this problem, to kind of dynamically plan missions around weather, to predict weather, to build things denser when weather is bad and spread them out when weather is good. Those kinds of techniques need to find their way into doctrine. They need to find their way into how an air defender thinks. They need to find their way into sort of a force structure in a way that enables actually all these other things that are also going to be increasingly weather dependent in the future. And so that's why we picked this.
Yeah, well, let me refer to two recent publications actually that I think inform here. So first is you and our colleague Pat Bazilchik recently did a paper on missile defense and weather. Admittedly, weather prediction has gotten better. That goes a long way to perhaps using things in the stratosphere differently or using things in the high atmosphere differently. But it also goes to what you just said about dynamically moving things around to contend with that. Admittedly, a place like Poland or a place like Guam is going to have a lot of cloudy days. There's going to be the occasional monsoon or what have you.
It's like 50% cloud cover like half the year.
But it's a very different philosophy to nevertheless accept the limitations and work the problem, as opposed to just say, well, you can't do it all the time, so therefore we shouldn't try. The other publication we put out on this recently is, we did some events on this as well, is why some of the advocates in the telecom industry for auctioning off the military S-band is perhaps not such a great idea. And I think it's, thankfully the reconciliation bill did not ultimately auction off the low 3 gigahertz of radar because it's so important for this mission. Do you want to talk a little bit about that as well? It's not this report. But
this has been our obsession for the past couple months, right? You need certain bands of radio frequency to see through weather, right? Precisely so you can do architectures like this. Proliferated EOIR architectures are only possible if you have the backstop of an all-weather radar. They kind of work together, right? EOIR can keep that wet radar switched off and let it, conserve radar resources and make it more survivable, right? And radar can kind of gap fill, cover, and do that kind of fire control quality track you would need to actually shoot down a missile. And so that nexus is not possible if we lose one of those legs. And so it's just so important to the future.
Yeah, I think that's a great foot stomp to end upon, which is that this is definitely multi-phenomenology, multi-domain. It's not putting all our eggs in the passive space Peleo basket. It's diversifying and contributing to survivability in lots of different ways. So I guess let me just close out here by saying, what's next? We've done all these different reports on sensor architecture, different types of sensors. What else needs to be looked at in kinds of our future studying and future thinking about? Yes, the mesh, yes, the data fusion, yes, the ground processing, those certainly come to mind. Anything else?
Well, in order to get this passive sensing done, in order to build sensors at scale, my recent interest has really been in our industrial base, right? How do we produce the actual parts needed to make these things, to make hundreds of things as opposed to singular things? When we're looking at the space layer, they're running into this challenge with their EOIR sensors. There are only 2 fabs in America that manufacture the specific, infrared sensor, right? It's like the image sensor in your camera that you need to see these things. Two. And to get to those larger and larger sizes, those yields go way down. How do we stimulate that industrial base to make visions like this possible? I think will be the next step. And then I guess the second thing is sensor integration, right? We talked about it with space, now we're talking about it with the ground. We're going to probably talk about it in the air and talk about it everywhere. When you deploy meshes, when you deploy swarms, when you deploy constellations, the hardest piece is that data infrastructure, that infrastructure that weaves it all together. And there's a patchwork of there's a patchwork of systems, there's a patchwork of programs to try and unify those streams. But that will be the major, the long pole in the tent, if you will, for these kinds of problems.
Yeah, and I think we're probably going to be hearing about that here very soon in terms of really the next couple of months. General Gutlein was just confirmed to take over as the head of the Golden Dome initiative, and I expect we'll be hearing some urgency around how do we put all these things together? How do we get area-wide surveillance of the continental United States to be able to detect and classify and combat ID a Russian cruise missile, for instance? So I think lots to come on this front, and especially on the data handling. Well, Masao, this has been a great conversation. I encourage folks to go online and take a look at the report. Mesh Sensing for Air Missile Defense, a vision for passive and proliferated sensor networks. And thanks as well to our sponsor of this report, the Sierra Nevada Corporation, and also general support to CSIS. And thanks to all of you for tuning in.
Thanks.